Okay, so this is where we're going to begin. Now, before we start, I want you to, first of all, notice the title of this presentation, The Chosen Nation versus Verus Israel. But more fundamentally, I want you to look at the statues behind it. And that's a very famous depiction in art. And this isn't the only representation of this idea, but it's in some paintings, it's in other statues around the world. This happens to be at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, which will be relevant a little bit later. But what's really, what I want you to notice about this is that, first of all, these two statues are called Ecclesia et Synagoga, which is Latin for the church and the synagogue. And on the left, we have the depiction of the church, which is a beautiful young woman who's standing tall and usually looking forward or up and holding a very strong staff with the cross at the top and holding a goblet, the goblet to catch the blood of Jesus on the cross. And and also wearing a crown. And on the right side, we have the synagogue, or the synagogue, which, as we can see, is another beautiful woman, but she's blinded. And if you can look closely, the blindfold that's covering her eyes is a snake. And I don't need to tell you what imagery that conjures up from the Bible. And she's holding a broken staff in her left hand, and in her right hand, she's holding the 10 Commandments, but they're slipping out of her hand. So kind of symbolizing how the law or the Torah is being lost from the synagogue, and it's kind of falling and going now to the church. So that's where I want to start with this image, and we're going to come back to it, and also the place of the Church of Notre Dame, it's going to become important. So before we begin, I want to talk about different views of the church, of Christianity, and of Judaism towards each other. How did these two very old traditions view one another? So the Jewish view on Christianity, by and large, other than viewing Christianity as a wrong theology, as a false religion, doesn't really come up that much, right? If you look through the Talmud, if you look through the early Jewish writings and even later Jewish writings, most of Judaism doesn't address Christianity. It kind of comes as a shock to most Christians, especially to missionaries. When you ask them, how often do you think Jews think about Jesus? Oh, they think about Jesus all the time. It's not true. Jews don't think about Jesus very often, and Jews don't think about Christianity very often, other than being a minority in a Christian country or in a Christian world, arguably. Jews don't think about Christianity all that often. On the other hand, Christianity views Judaism a lot, and Judaism is very important in Christian theology and Christian doctrine, and this goes back to the founding of Christianity. And the place I want to begin that is with Augustine, who, as we see, lived from 354 to 430. And he had a doctrine which would influence the church for many, many centuries after that, which was his doctrine of the suffering witnesses. He was talking about Tehillim 59:12, which I encourage you to look up. And the idea was that the Jews are important and necessary for the world because they serve as these suffering, wandering witnesses. The question is, if the Jews are if Judaism is an incorrect religion, why does God tolerate Judaism at all? And Augustine's answer was the Jews need to be around because they serve as God's, as the witnesses for the true religion. And they do this in four ways. So first of all, the four theological reasons for why Christians would tolerate Judaism, even though they consider it a false religion. First of all, Jews are masters of biblical Hebrew, and a lot of the Christians in the church, when they would learn Hebrew, often it would be either from Jews or from Jews who had converted to Christianity. The second reason was that they all knew, and they admit in the New Testament and many other places, Jesus himself was a Jew. So the Jews at some level, according to Christians, are not just another group of people. They have some elevated status because that was the group that gave birth to their Messiah. The third is that the theological idea Christians have that ultimately Jews would convert and embrace Christianity at the end of days, and that would signify the end of the second coming. And finally, the fourth is, as I said before, Augustine's idea of the suffering witnesses, that throughout history, Jews serve as witnesses to the truth of Christianity because we maintain the law, we keep the Torah, and that keeps alive the ideas of the Old Testament and that serves as a witness to what they believe is their religion. So this presentation is going to focus a lot on one Jewish book, or a series of Jewish books, specifically the Talmud, which we spoke a little bit about in the last class. And so what is the Talmud? Well, first of all, it's a lot of the post-biblical Jewish literature. It composes the Mishnah and Tosefta, which we said last class were written or composed in the year 200 approximately. Then the Talmud itself, the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, that was put together in various locations throughout Iraq and Israel. And then the Midrashim, some of which talk about the Agadata, some of which talk about Halacha, and all of these compose the Talmudic corpus. And that's discussed and learned and developed by the Geonim, who are the post-Talmudic heads of the yeshiva in Iraq and in Sur and Pumbedisa, as we discussed last week. And they are the people who are teaching the Talmud. And to this point in history, until about the 11th century, the Talmud is a very isolated and expert enterprise. And what I mean by that is that very few people were learning it. It wasn't spread across the Jewish nation because Talmud's very difficult. And if you have to work for a living, especially if you're working in the Middle Ages or earlier, it's very hard to spend a lot of time to develop the language skills, to develop the critical thinking skills, to really dissect and understand what's going on in the Gemara. So it's really, I don't think, an exaggeration to say that at some points in Jewish history, there might have been less than 100 people who were able to learn a piece of Gemara. But that all changed with one person, and that person's name was Rashi. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Rashi. He wrote this incredibly important commentary on the Talmud, and that increased its, not just its popularity, but its accessibility. And Rashi's comments are very simple, very explanatory. They're written in very easy Hebrew. And he even throws in explanations of the Aramaic with French vernacular words sometimes, which is the language of the people he's writing for. But even if you don't know French, Rashi makes the Gemara from a closed text to the majority of people to really a very accessible and open text. And this begins a process of Talmud learning and Talmudization, where this text explodes and many, many different people begin to learn the Talmud, and it opens the way for the Balei HaTosfos. Balei HaTosfos were Rashi's grandsons and his sons-in-law and his students and their students and their sons and their sons-in-law. And they embark on this project where they detail the Talmud in very deep ways. And this explodes and throughout the entire Jewish nation, creating the possibility of learning the Talmud at an unprecedented level until that point. So that's really good and really important. And at the same time, it was a double-edged sword. Why do I say that? Because the beginning of the Jews being able to learn the Gemara was also the beginning of the Christians being able to access the Gemara. First of all, through Rashi's commentary, which really opens the Talmud for most people who have a basic grasp of the language to learn the Gemara. But more fundamentally, when more Jews learn the Gemara, and then some of them convert to Christianity, now they're converting with that added weapon. They know the Talmud. When the Talmud is only being learned by a very select elite, then it's a lot easier to contain it within the Jewish people. But once the book has been expanded and is being discussed throughout the entire nation, it becomes a lot harder to contain. And now we start seeing within the century or a few decades after Rashi composed his commentary, we start to see this anti-Talmudic literature being written by Christians against the Jews. So Petrus Alfonsi wrote a dialogue against the Jews. He was actually a Jew who converted to Christianity, and he writes on Maseches Brachos, and he talks about a lot of the anthropomorphic descriptions of God, how God has a body, or the Gemara in Brachos talks about how God wears tefillin, and that's how Moshe learned how to tie the knot the right way, and many other things. He only quotes from Maseches Brachos, but nevertheless, he has this big diatribe against the Jews in that book, and that book becomes very harmful and does a lot of harm to the Jewish people. It's a little bit ironic that a Christian would attack another religion for anthropomorphic descriptions of God when in basic Christian theology, Jesus as a man, don't get more anthropomorphic than that for a God, but nevertheless, this is what he writes. And also Peter the Venerable, who was the abbot of Cluny, also writes another book, and there are a few others. And Peter the Venerable was not a Jew, and he writes in his book, I bet you, you wretched Jews who are reading this work, you want to know where I learned the Talmud from. And because I know it's going to upset you, I'm not going to tell you. So this is what we're dealing with. But he doesn't only quote from Petrus Alfonsi, he quotes from other places as well. So it must be that he had another source that he learned it from. So that's the Talmud. Now, the church, by the way, it must be understood that there was always this attitude of toleration. And this goes as far as 1199. This is an official papal bull that I want to read because it's really very important to understand the attitude of what's going on. Here it writes that the Jews need to be protected, that although in many ways the disbelief of the Jews must be reproved, since nevertheless through them our own faith is truly proved, they must not be oppressed grievously by the faithful. So they prove our own faith, like Augustine said, they are the suffering witnesses, so they must not be grievously oppressed. So they ought to suffer no prejudice. We, in keeping in the footprints of our predecessors, we admit their petition. We're going to give them what they want, which is what? We make the law that no Christian compel them by violence to come to baptism. They can't be forcibly converted. But if any of them should spontaneously fly to the Christians, let him be made a Christian without any calumny. 2, no Christian ought to presume to injure their persons or with violence to take their property, or to change the good customs which they had until now. And besides, in the celebration of their own festivities, no one ought to disturb them in any way with clubs or stones. In other words, don't attack them when they go to shul. And we decree that no one ought to dare mutilate or diminish a Jewish cemetery, nor in order to get money to exhume bodies once they have been buried. And if anyone shall attempt, once the tenor of this decree has been known, to go against it, let him be punished by the vengeance of excommunication, unless he correct his presumption by making equivalent satisfaction. So this is a pretty serious punishment. Excommunication in the Catholic Church is a very big deal. This is the church protecting the Jews as late as the year 1199. And that was a general Christian attitude they had all the way from Augustine throughout. So, and I see there's a question here. Why didn't it get followed? Good question. And we're going to talk about why this changed and what actually happened. So what happened to this law? Why did it get changed? Well, changes in the church, trouble for the Jews. So I want to talk about one Pope, Pope Innocent III. He's the first Pope to call himself the Vicar of Christ, which essentially means that there is no salvation except through the Catholic Church. And he wages many wars against different heresies against the church, not Jewish heresies, but other Christian heresies. And he wins a lot of these battles, and he comes in with a big victorious attitude. And he oversees the Fourth Lateran Council, and that's a very important event that really sparks a lot of change in the general church official attitude towards the Jews. So the Fourth Lateran Council has these 70 new decrees, which again reflect the new triumphant, victorious attitude of the church. This is the first time in history where we have a law on record where Jews are told to wear distinctive clothing. So this is the origin, the first time a Jew has to wear a yellow star. And it talks about, again, for the first time, the persecution of non-Christian heretics. So the idea that now the church isn't only going to go after Christian heresies, but also other heresies beyond the church as well. And around this time is also when the Inquisition starts. So this is when the church is really getting very, very serious about going after theological heresies and different bad ideas. Up till this point, they were engaged in the Crusades. They were having all these wars against Muslims. Believe it or not, there were certain popes who weren't very religious. There were popes with girlfriends, popes with boyfriends, and popes who had children. But now the church is really getting very serious and becoming more theological, and that's going to be a big problem for the Jews. Now, Jewish-Christian interactions. There were certain attitudes, and this is among Jews, about what to do if you are roped into a conversation with a Christian. Should you be very argumentative? Should you try to prove your point? Should you kind of let them win the argument and try to save your skin? So two competing ideas. One is from Nitzachon Yashan, who says here, "B'dvarcha imahem when you speak with them, when you speak to the Christians, al tanichehu likanis midavar ledavar. Don't allow them to jump from one topic to another. That's the way of the impatient and brazen Gentiles. They like to jump from one topic to another topic. When they see they're not going to be able to prove their words, they try to jump to other topics. Whoever argues with them should be like a warrior, to answer or ask on one topic. You should not allow them to extricate themselves from that topic until you've completed the entire thing. And then you'll find that this non-Jew will be very embarrassed, and yimtza the ikar kofer, and excuse me, and it will emerge that he'll deny the fundamentals of his own religion, and he goes on to say that, and then he'll convert to Judaism. So that's a very challenging and argumentative approach that if you see that he's trying to go to another topic or change the subject, don't do it and continue and fight against him. But however, the Mechamos Hashem of Jacob ben Ruvain and the Eidos Hashem Ne'amana of Solomon de Rossi have the exact opposite approach. And they say that if you are arguing with a Christian and you're winning the argument, don't take it too hard on him. And if he tries to change the subject, go with the change of. In fact, you should try to change the subject if you see that you're winning. So and I can understand that attitude too, and you can understand it as well. If you're a minority group and you're worried about persecution and you're worried about offending the sensibilities of the class that is in charge at the time, you got to be careful what you say. And the modern version of this is be careful what you put on YouTube, be careful what you post on Facebook. You can't just say everything. And yes, freedom of speech and all that, but you got to be careful with what you write and what you say. So these are the two approaches to Jewish-Christian interactions, and this is interactions that are happening on the street, not in official circumstances, but just in between friends or between people who are working together or someone from the community or so on and so forth. These are the kinds of things that those are talking about. But what was an example of something which was a very sharp example of the Nitzachon Yashan? I wish I could read this whole thing, but I don't think I can. But here, Nitzachon Yashan, and I'm going to leave this here. If you look back on YouTube, I recommend looking at this entire Hebrew text because it's really quite fascinating that someone would write this in the Middle Ages. But here he talks about some of the very challenging and very nasty comments that were going on between Jews and Christians. And in this case, there is some evidence that this was actually said between Jews and Christians. So in short, what this is that the Nitzachon Yashan writes that what's the reason why Christians do the confession? In other words, the confession where they go into a private room and Christians will confess to the priest regarding their sins. And he says essentially that the reason they do this is so that if there's an adulterer who's having an affair with a married woman, that person will go to the priest and admit their sin. Then later, that married woman who's having an affair with this person will go to the same priest and admit her own sins. And then the priest will tell her, listen, I know what you've been doing. I know your sin. And I want to do the same thing. And that's the reason why the Christians do confession according to the Nitzachon Yashan, so that the priest will be able to know which women are engaging in adultery and will be able to then go and corner these women and request similar favors from them. Now, that's a very sharp and disrespectful thing to say. But that's an example of the kinds of things that some Jews might have been saying to Christians. So, and you can understand if you're a Christian that that's very disrespectful and really would offend your sensibilities. But nevertheless, this is kind of a worst case example, but it is an example that we have evidence was actually said, and a Jew was brought to court for this in France. So it was not a small deal. So those were the informal discussions back and forth. There were three main official disputations, however. One took place in Paris in 1240. There was one in Barcelona in 1263 and in Tortosa in 1413 to 1414. As we'll see, the only one of these which could accurately be called a disputation was the one in Barcelona. The other two were something less than that. But nevertheless, these are the three most important ones that we have a strong record of what happened there. So let's talk about the Paris Disputation. So it starts with a person named Nicholas Donin, and each one of these disputations is going to begin with some kind of a Jew who had converted to Christianity. A Jew who had converted to Christianity is going to be the driving force behind all of these disputations. So Nicholas Donin was a Jew who was in the community of Rabbi Chil of Paris, who was one of the Balei HaTosfos that we spoke about earlier. And he developed some Karaite sympathies. He started to question whether there was an oral Torah and maybe there's only a written Torah. And because of this, the rabbis in his town put him in cherem. They excommunicated him. And he sat in excommunication for 7 years. During the excommunication, no one's allowed to talk to you, and you have to sit embarrassed in shul, and it's really a very uncomfortable experience. And during that time, some Christians were talking to him, and some opportunistic Christians were really getting to him and saying, you should convert and you should come join the church, which he does. He joins the church, and he levels 35 separate claims against the Talmud. He submits them to Pope Gregory IX, and Pope Gregory IX issues a letter because what Nicholas Donin wrote against the Talmud essentially boiled down to three main charges, or four main categories of charges. The first one is that the Talmud contains blasphemy against the church. The second one is that it contains anti-Christian ideas, meaning anti-Christian discrimination. The third is that it contains these obscene and ridiculous stories. And there he's talking about the various events or stories written in the Agadata. So Pope Gregory IX issues this letter. And the fourth claim that Nicholas Donin had, the fourth category of claims, really encompasses all of them, and that's that the Jews believe in the Talmud or follow the Talmud even more strongly than they keep the Bible. And that really goes to the heart of this issue, because as we saw until now, the Jews, if they were to be the witnesses, the Augustinian witnesses, where he said that the Jews are allowed to exist in Christian lands, and they are allowed to practice their religion because they are the witnesses and they serve testimony to the Old Testament. If the Jews aren't really following the Torah and are following this other book, that calls into question the entire basis of Christian tolerance of the Jews. And that's a very serious accusation. That would essentially relegate the entire Jewish people to something less than the third-class status that they had under Christian countries. So this is a very serious claim. And the Pope responds in kind. He writes that if what is said about the Jews of France and of the other lands is true, no punishment will be sufficiently worthy of their crime, because not content with the old law which God gave to Moses in writing, they affirm that God gave another law, which is called the Talmud. And the volume of this by far exceeds the text of the Bible. And in this is contained matter so abusive and so unspeakable that it arouses shame in those who mention it and horror in those who hear it. And this is said to be the most important reason why the Jews remain obstinate in their perfidy. So the Pope is saying, I don't understand. Why is it that the Jews don't see the light? Why don't they convert to Christianity? Why don't they accept Jesus? Well, of course, it makes total sense. They have this book, the Talmud, and that's what is keeping them obstinate and not seeing the light and converting to the true religion. So what does the Pope prescribe? He says, on the first Saturday of Lent to come, or the following Lent, on Shabbos, while all the Jews are gathered in their synagogues, you by our authority shall seize all the books belonging to the Jews of your kingdom. So, and you should give them to the Dominican and the Franciscan friars. So this is very serious, because Jews are, there's one thing that really not hold us back, but if there's one thing that's essential about Jewish culture, it's our books. If you take away Jewish books and really and in a way where we can't have access to them, you've taken away most of what we have access to and most of what we can do. That's a really sinister way to cut at the heart of the Jewish people. So the one king who really takes this seriously was King Louis IX, and he confiscates all the books and all the Talmuds, and they hold them by the Dominican friars, and he sets up this disputation. Now, a disputation really means a debate. This wasn't a debate. This was a trial. This was putting the Talmud on trial to see if the claims of Nicholas Donin were actually correct. So the main defenders, or the Jewish lawyers, we can say, were the four rabbis, four grade A rabbis, truly great rabbis. One was Yechiel of Paris, who was mentioned in the Balei Tosfos. One was Moshe Kusi, who was the author of the Sefer Mitzvos Gadol, and two other prominent Tosafists. And this disputation took place over a few days, or a little more than a week. And the Yechiel of Paris and Moshe Kusi was really done like an inquisition. They were not allowed to see their accuser, so they never really interacted with Nicholas Donin. And they were asked about the Talmud and asked all these questions. And does the Talmud contain blasphemy? Does the Talmud say things against Christians, against God? Yechiel of Paris had a very famous retort, because there's a passage in the Talmud which talks about Jesus, who is the disciple of Yeshua ben Prachia, and this Jesus was went away from God and started worshiping rocks and things like this. So they asked him, like, is this how your Talmud talks about Jesus? He says, no, it's not. That Jesus, that Yeshu mentioned in the Talmud is not Jesus. That's another figure. So they didn't believe him. And in fact, in the Christian account of this disputation, they write constantly, the rabbi said this, but it's clear that he's lying. And it's clear that he's not telling the truth. So at the very end of this disputation, in the Christian version of the account that we have, they write the confessions of Master Vivo. Vivo here is like the word vital or life. So it's Yechiel. Master Vivo is Rabbi Yechiel, and Master Judas, which is Rabbi Yehuda, one of the other two rabbis defending the Bible, defending the Talmud. So in their confession, they write that at the beginning, the said Master Vivo refused entirely to swear an oath, which is true. He said, I never swore an oath in my life, and therefore I'm not going to swear an oath now. And the Christian said, no, please make him swear an oath, because he's going to lie. He's going to lie anyway, and that's why he doesn't want to swear an oath. But in the end, they didn't make him swear an oath. And he went on to say that he said that the Talmud never lied. And he said that the Jesus Jesus was born of adultery, and that he was punished in hell in boiling excrement, which is another passage in the Talmud. And he says, however, this was a different man from our Jesus, but he could not say who else it was. And it is sufficiently clear based on this that he was lying. He said further that in the schools, they study the Talmud more earnestly than the Bible, and that no one can be called rabbi unless he knows the Talmud, even if he knows the Bible by heart. And so on and so forth. And he tried to defend the Talmud in this way, but really they weren't buying it. And as I said, this is really playing not only as an away team in someone else's house, but really following their rules. So they don't buy anything that Rabbi Yechiel said, and also what the other three rabbis said either. And what this leads to was a very tragic event, which we have depicted here, the burning of the Talmud next to the Church of Notre Dame. Now, if you can see this picture, they're carrying in cartloads of scrolls, essentially, bringing it here to be burnt. And this is next to if we would be able to see this from the front on, these two statues are actually the statues that we saw at the beginning of this session, the synagoga Ecclesia et Synagoga. Those two statues are right up here. So 24 wagon loads of the Talmud are burned. And this is an unbelievable blow. This is a time in history before the printing press. And if you wanted to write or to have a Talmud, you had to copy it over by hand. And there are certain Talmuds. There's actually one very interesting inscription at the end of one of the Talmuds from this, that were copied over by hand, which says that this edition of whatever it was, Bava Basra, was written by such and such woman, the daughter of so-and-so. And if there are any mistakes in the Talmud, I apologize, especially towards the end, because I'm currently in my 9th month and I'm having lots of pain in my pregnancy. So if there are any mistakes, I apologize. So this was a massive blow to the Jewish people, and it caused the center of Torah, which up till that point had been in that area of France to move to Germany with the following person, the Maharam of Rotenburg, who was one of the students of Yechiel of Paris at the time. And he witnessed this event and he wrote a Kinah about it that we say on Tisha B'Av, which is really very, very harrowing. And if you know the background of this disputation and what I said, it really brings it to life here. So this is not the whole Kinah, it's only a few lines, but the ones that I highlighted are really very, very moving. Here, Teished Berov Ga'ava, you who sit with your much haughtiness. This is referring to the church. Lishbot Bnei El, to judge the sons of God. B'chol HaMishpatim, with all of your judgments. B'tavi B'flilayach, and you enter into your judgment. And he goes on, Arid Ma'os Adayu Kanachal, I will let my tears fall until they become a stream. The Agil Kivros Shnei Sarayat Silayach, and the stream will go forth until it reaches two of our great leaders. Who are two great leaders? Moshe and Aharon, Moses and Aaron, the Horahar and Horahar, the Esh'al, and I will ask them, Hayesh Torah Chadashah, is there a new Torah? In other words, has the Torah, our holy Torah, been usurped by the New Testament? And B'chein Nisrafu Galilayach, is this the reason why our holy texts have been burned? Etmal nafshi ve'ech ya'rab l'chiki, my soul is confused. And how will I ever be able to taste again, achol, any food, after I've seen that they've gathered all these holy works, in the midst of the city, like a condemned city. So this is a very powerful poem with some very powerful and serious questions. And this is written by an eyewitness, by someone who was actually there and saw the burning actually take place. One of the most powerful kinos that we have. So that was the 1240, the Paris Disputation. On to the figure of the Ramban, who's the central figure in the Disputation of Barcelona. Now, if the rabbis who were able to sit at the Disputation of Paris were grade A rabbis, Ramban was an A+, because he was truly one of the most important, not only one of the most important rabbis in his time, but one of the most important rabbis in history. He engaged in the Maimonidean controversies of 1232, where he wrote letters back and forth to the to the anti-Rambam people, and he really put out the fire and was able to really get everyone to calm down. So he was very important over there. He wrote these classic commentaries on the Torah, on the Talmud. We have many of his published drushos. He wrote essential footnotes under the Rambam and Mechamos Hashem against Zerachei Halevi, which is a Mechamos Hashem that I don't think we're going to be able to cover in this series. He was the Rebbe of the Rashba, was also a towering, super important figure, another grade A+ rabbi, and was the grandfather of Ralbag, who's one of the most important Jewish philosophers in Jewish history. Ramban, like Maimonides, was a physician, was a doctor, and for reasons we'll discuss, he made Aliyah at the age of 73. So he's the main Jewish force at the Barcelona Disputation, the second one we're going to discuss. And the Barcelona Disputation was an actual disputation. It was a real debate where there were people there was a real fighting chance for the Jews. The king at the time, James I of Aragon, gave the Ramban total freedom of speech, and he guaranteed that I will let you say whatever you want, and you don't have to worry for your life, for the life of the Jewish community. They have my personal protection. And the person Ramban was debating against was Pablo Christiani, who was another Jew who had converted to Christianity. And Pablo Christiani was influenced by Raymond de Pennefort. And Raymond de Pennefort was very interesting because he engaged in a lot of missionary work. He commissioned the entire Quran to be translated into Latin so that the Christians could read it and try to convert the Muslims. He also tried to reach out to the Jews. He influenced Raymond Martini to write Pugio Fidei, which was one of the most dangerous books against the Jews and against the Talmud in Jewish history, in the grand tradition of anti-Talmudic books. He influenced Thomas Aquinas to write a book, a missionary book towards the Gentiles to get them to convert to Christianity. And the tactic taken in this debate was very different, because in the previous debate, they were trying to show how harmful and dangerous and blasphemous and disgusting the Talmud was. In this case, they weren't doing that. In this case, public Christianity was trying to show how the Talmud actually proves the existence of Jesus. Not the existence of Jesus, but how it proves that Jesus is the Messiah and certain other important Christian doctrines. So public Christianity will get up and quote the Gemara, which talks about the world being 6,000 years from start to finish, 2,000 years of Tohu, 2,000 years of Torah, and then 2,000 years of Mashiach. So if one understands that from a Christological perspective, that means that for 2,000 years, from the time the Torah was given until Jesus came, that's when we keep the Torah. But then once Jesus comes about 2,000 years ago, until for the last 2,000 years, until the year 6,000, that's when the Messiah comes, and therefore we don't have to keep the Torah anymore. So he's arguing against the Ramban, and the Ramban a few times tried to get the disputation to stop, but he really doesn't hold back. And he really does express his, and this is debated, but he really does express very strong views against public Christianity, what public Christianity is saying, with the guarantee of James I of Aragon. And even in this best case scenario, it doesn't turn out well for the Ramban or for the Talmud, because ultimately what ends up is that the Talmud gets heavily censored, and the Ramban, who published his own Hebrew account of what happened at the Barcelona Disputation, was chased after by Dominican friars, and he had to make Aliyah and escape to Israel in order to essentially save his life. But I want to show you, there was a movie that was made about the Barcelona Disputation based on the Ramban's writing of this. And just to give you an idea of the best case scenario of what happens when a Jew is guaranteed perfect freedom of expression and freedom of religion and is allowed to speak his mind, even in that scenario, how dangerous it could be. So just very short clip, take a look at this. I'm getting that there's no sound. I'm not sure why that is, but I apologize. I'll leave a link. This is really very powerful video. And basically there's a back and forth between, on the right side here, we have the Ramban, on the left, we have Pablo Cristiani, and they are talking about the divinity of Jesus, whether he was a man or God or a satanic figure. And this line of dialogue got the Ramban in a lot of trouble. And I apologize that this is not playing, because this is a very powerful clip, but nevertheless, we have to continue. So I'll leave a video, and I recommend to watch this clip from this movie. Now, the third disputation, Tortosa. This disputation, so the Paris Disputation wasn't a disputation, it was a trial of the Talmud. And the Barcelona Disputation was an actual debate, a real disputation. This was neither. There's no kind way of saying this. This was a form of intimidation and discrimination, and really very nasty attempt to break the spirit and the bodies, essentially, of the Jewish people. So up till this point in history, and for about a century before this, the Jews were very important economic figures in this part of Europe. But slowly but surely, the Jews stopped being economically relevant. And when the Jews stopped being economically relevant, the church started going after them a lot more systematically and started attacking them in very serious ways. And this came to a head in the year 1391, where there was this massive massacre against the Jewish community. Many thousands of people were killed. Chaz de Crescas, who's the next person on this list, his son was killed in this massacre. And throughout Europe, there were these marauding bands of Christians. Often they were not sent by the church, mind you. They were spurred by by lower priests who would whip up the frenzy of these people and get them to go after the Jews. And the church quite often condemned this, but not enough to actually make it stop. So many great rabbis were killed around this time, and the Jewish people were in a very low state in terms of their spiritual vitality and in terms of their physical well-being and their mental well-being. They're really in a very low place. Vincent Ferrer was one of the chief instigators for these things. He was the one who really pushed for the Tortosa Disputation to happen. And the main Christian disputant was a man named Maestro Geronimo de Santa Fe, who in the Jewish account, they highlight the first letters of his name. So Maestro Geronimo de Santa Fe, which they say stands for Megadef, which is a very insulting term for him, but nevertheless, I totally understand why they did it. His name had been Yeshua Hawarki. He had converted to Christianity. Vincent Ferrer had been the one who converted him. And in this case, they weren't satisfied with one or the other approach to the Talmud, not the approach of Nicholas Donian, that it's entirely negative, and not the approach of Pablo Christianity, that it was a positive way to prove Christianity, but they actually took both sides of this argument. So how did they do that? He said that really the core essence of the Talmud was pro-Christian. But because the Jews are so perfidious and so nasty and so duplicitous and such liars, they overlaid it with a bunch of anti-Christian stuff. So when you find pro-Christian ideas in the Talmud, that's something which clearly must have been an original part of the Talmud, but the Jews covered it over with so much anti-Christian stuff. When you find anti-Christian stuff, that's just a Jewish invention that came later in history. So this disputation was done in the presence of the anti-Pope Benedict XIII, and anti-Pope because ultimately there were a few people at the time claiming to be the Pope, and he was only one of them. And later they decided he was not the official Pope at the time. It was another one of these other popes. But nevertheless, that's really kind of beside the point. To the Jews who were there and trying to defend the Talmud, this may as well have been the Pope. He had a lot of political power, and it's possibly the case that this anti-Pope was trying to use this disputation to propel his popularity and to get and to propel him to become recognized as Pope by the entire Christian population. So as I said before, many important rabbis had been killed or had died. Chazdai Kreskas, who we spoke about earlier, was one of the most important rabbis who was alive at the time, or rather was alive in his time, but he died 2 years before this disputation took place. Had he been alive, he would probably have been called on to represent the Jewish people. Nevertheless, there were 16 Jews who were called on. The two most prominent were Dan Ashtak Halevi, who wasn't really a rabbi, who was a prominent Jew, and the one real prominent rabbi who was present was Rav Yosef Albo, and at least 14 others who were there. So, as we said before, Yechiel of Paris in the first disputation was a grade A, was an A level rabbi. Ramban was a level A plus, and here we have a lot of B's and C's and even D's. We really don't have anyone who's remotely like the Ramban or even like the Balei Tosfos or the Smag, who were at the earlier disputations. So here the Jews were constantly intimidated and really put in their place, so much so that they actually issued a plea for mercy. And this is what they write. This is what Ashtak Halevi writes. He says that we have been taken away from our homes. Our resources have been diminished, and we are almost entirely destroyed. Huge damage is resulting in our communities from our absence. Indeed, it was recorded that while these 16 Jewish communal leaders were away from their communities, Vincent Ferrer had taken mobs of Christian peasants to go and terrorize Jews in their communities. Huge damage is resulting in our communities from our absence. We don't know the fate of our wives and children. We have inadequate maintenance here and even a lack of food. Why should people suffering such woes be held accountable for their arguments when contending with Geronimo and others who are in the greatest prosperity and luxury? In other words, we are in such a lowly position, and you have so much privilege at your disposal. why are you holding us accountable if we give bad arguments? We are so lowly, and and you can understand why they're saying this, and you can really sympathize with where they're coming from. Nevertheless, they get no sympathy whatsoever. Geronimo responds that a teacher from whom others ought to derive an example should show fortitude, which is to sustain the attacks of adversity. And he goes on to say, since you regard yourself as a teacher, you ought to be an example to others and ought not to be moved by thoughts of your wife or by any other tribulation. And even if by reason of unspirituality you become affected by such things, this effect should be of short duration, since sensuality ought to be defeated by reason, which indeed becomes purer in adversity than in prosperity. So really nasty ways of responding to the Jews. And that was this entire disputation. During the disputation, at several times, they brought in whole hordes of Jewish people and converted them to Christianity, not necessarily against their will, but at the end of the day, how willing was it really? And basically to show these rabbis, you guys are losing your argument. You're part of a very lowly and suffering religion. Why don't you see the light already and come over to the Christian faith? So this disputation really highlights, more than anything else, the most difficult Christian theological challenge against the Jews, because all the other challenges that Christians raised against them, and there are many that we don't have time to discuss now, but claims about references to Jesus in the Old Testament, or certain verses that imply that God has multiple parts, or that God is a Trinity, or different proofs from different places of what the Messianic age will look like, or things like this. If Christians did not exist, if Christians hadn't been around to level these questions against the Jews wouldn't really have to answer them. They'd never have to deal with them. But the one claim that the Jews would have to deal with if the Christians were not around is the question of Jewish suffering. Because if the Jews are truly God's chosen people, why is it that they're suffering? Why is it that they're in such a difficult and depressing exile? Why isn't it that God would send us the Mashiach already? And you have to understand that this is long before we had the state of Israel and places like the United States where we have religious freedom and things like this. In the midst of the Middle Ages, especially when the Christians are all fighting against you, this is a very serious challenge. And this disputation really highlights that. And at the end of the day, the Jews didn't really have a very good answer to that question, and largely still don't. There are many attempts at answering the question, but it's a very serious challenge, and one that we still deal with today. So aftermath of the disputation is that masses and masses of Jews, many Jews, convert to Christianity, again, willingly, or how willing was it? Not so clear. And through the next 6-7 decades, these Jews are roaming around. There are these Jews who have been converted because they were either intimidated or they were fed up with being this lowly class of people, which again, totally understand. You can't judge them at all for making that decision in that very, very challenging circumstance. But through the next decades, now, what would you do? And this is a question we should all think about. If you had a relative who had converted to Christianity, not because they really wanted to, but because they were trying to escape persecution or trying to elevate themselves from this very lowly status in life, and this relative of yours was asking for a siddur, or asking for a chumash, or saying, teach me how to light Shabbos candles, or give me some kosher meat, or things like this, what would we do? Of course we'd help them. No question we'd help them. But this interaction between the Jews who had converted and the Jews who had not converted was very insulting to the Christians, especially in Spain. And this led in 1492 to one of the most tragic events in our history, the Spanish expulsion. March 31st of 1492. And here's the actual text of the Alahambra Decree. This is only 80 years later. It says, we were informed that in our realms, there were some bad Christians who Judaized. In other words, some Christians who had gone back to Judaism. The chief cause was the communication between the Christians and the Jews. Therefore, in 1480, this is 12 years before this, 1480, we ordained that the said Jews be set apart in Jewish quarters, hoping that with this separation, the matter would be corrected. However, many offenders have been revealed by the inquisitors. The Inquisition was still going on, and thereby has established the great damage to the Christians, which has resulted from the communication which they have held with the Jews. This is proved by the many confessions, both of the Jews themselves and also of those who were corrupted and deceived by them. It was our wish to be content with ordering them to leave Andalusia in the belief that this would be sufficient for those in other places. However, every day it's discovered and made manifest that the said Jews continue ever more in their evil and harmful purpose in every place where they dwell. Having considered the matter with much deliberation, we are agreed in ordering that all Jews of our said realms should leave and never return by the end of July. Remember, this was only in March, and this is July, 3 months later, under the penalty that if they do not do so, they incur the punishment of death and the confiscation of all their property with no trial, nor sentence, nor declaration. So this was the aftermath, and this was the result. And this is the product of the Jews being in that lowly situation and them trying to help their family maintain some connection to their Jewish religion, which I believe we would all do. And this is the outcome of this. And the picture that's behind this is a picture of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the monarchs who were the ones who signed this decree and who wrote it and effected it. And this is the status of the Jews at this point in the Middle Ages. Barbanel was one of the Jews who left Spain, but many Jews didn't. Many Jews decided to stay in Spain and to remain there, which we can't judge them either. It's a very, very difficult decision. And given the choice, what would we do? I sure hope I never have to answer that question. So up to this point, it's been very, very sad and very downplaying, with the attack, and we see this steady decline in the Jewish status until we finally get this massive explosion in the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. But the story continued, and this is not where the story continued. And I want to fast forward nearly 500 years to the modern day, to one of the most important and one of the brightest and really one of the most optimistic statements put out by the church. This is called Nostra Aetate, which means in our time. It was in 1965. And this was their statement towards other religions, non-Christian religions. This is what the Catholic Church had to say about those. It says, in our time, when day by day mankind is being drawn closer together and the ties between different peoples are becoming stronger, the church examines more closely her relationship to non-Christian religions. In her task of promoting unity and love among men, she considers above all in this declaration what men have in common and what draws them to fellowship. The church acknowledges that according to God's saving design, the beginnings of her faith are found already among the patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. The church therefore cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God in his inexpressible mercy concluded the ancient covenant. As Holy Scripture testifies, Jerusalem did not recognize the time of her visitation, nor did the Jews in large number accept the gospel. In other words, the Jews did not see Jesus as the promised Messiah. Nevertheless, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Since the spiritual patrimony common to Jews and Christians and Jews is thus so great, this sacred synod wants to foster and recommend mutual understanding and respect. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews, then alive, nor again the Jews of today. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. Furthermore, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. Now, this statement is unbelievable, that the church, which for so long, for so many centuries, had been one of the biggest enemies and attacking the Jews and persecuting them and keeping them down, for them to now put this kind of a statement out and to actually live by it is truly really unbelievable. So to bring this full circle, we began with this picture of ecclesia et synagoga, with the church on the left, represented by the beautiful woman with the crown and the intact staff and the goblet, and the synagogue on the right being another beautiful woman who's blinded, as you can see, blinded by a snake who's wrapping around her eyes, holding a broken staff and falling luchos, falling commandments, which represents them losing grip on the law. They're trying to hold on to a dead covenant. So this was how the image of the Ecclesiad Synagogue was portrayed for most of history. However, in recent times, we have a new statute. And this is called Ecclesia et Synagoga in our time. In our time is the translation of Nostra Aetate, the statement I just read. And here we have on the left, the synagogue, which is the synagogue, the Jews, this time wearing a crown and holding a Torah. And next to her, Ecclesia, the church, also wearing a crown and holding what I assume would be a Bible or New Testament. And here they're both wearing crowns, both looking forward, neither one blindfolded. And the spirit of progress and spirit of mutual understanding, or at least trying to come together. So there's a lot that the Christians have done, the Catholics have done through history against the Jews. But the first step of tshuva, as Ramban points out, is to stop doing what you're doing, to reject the sin. And Rambam says that a person who says they're going to do tshuva while still doing the sin is like a tovel v'sheretz b'yado. They're like someone who goes into the mikvah while holding on to an impure animal. No matter how many times they dunk, they will remain impure. The first step is to stop doing what you're doing. So is this possible? Is it possibly the case that after all this time, the Jews and the Christians might be able to come together for some form of mutual understanding and respect? Well, that's a question that remains to be seen, but hopefully there is reason for some optimism. And with that, I will stay on if anybody has any questions, but if not, we can call it a day. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned something. Oh, we have a question. Sorry, I forgot to give you guys unmuting power. Okay, you can unmute yourself if anybody has a question. More than happy to hear it.
Hi, Avi, Yasher Koach. That went really well. I thought it was very informative. So my question is, regarding the second statue, when was that commissioned? Was that commissioned like 1965 or 60 something, whatever that second petition was made? Was it at the same time?
That was much later.
Or is it a bit after? Or and where is it located? Because I'm really curious about that.
That's in the University of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. So it's in the United States. The Pope actually visited that statue and blessed it a few years ago.
Blessed a statue?
Yes.
How does one bless a statue? You give it a bracha?
There was an article about this. He made a blessing over it, and he definitely was very supportive. He was very happy to see it.
Okay, sure. The idea of okay. You know what? We have brachas and rainbows, so I can't knock them. Okay. Have an amazing night.
Okay. Thank you all so much.